Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writing with Style. My name is Lara McCowie, and I am the stage manager for this event. I am pleased to welcome you to our 10th annual Wild Writers Literary Festival, which is brought to you by Wordsworth Books, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and the new quarterly literary magazine. Before we begin, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our festival donors and sponsors, including the Ontario Arts Council, the NAP Wealth Management Team of RBC Dominion Securities, and Audi Kitchener-Waterloo. And now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Shashi Bhat. Shashi is the author of The Most Precious Substance on Earth and a forthcoming short story collection. Her debut novel, The Family Took Shape, was a finalist for the Thomas Raddall Atlantic Fiction Award. Shashi's fiction has appeared in publications including the New Quarterly, the Malahat Review, the Fiddlehead, Best Canadian Stories 2018 and 2019, Journey Prize Stories 24 and 30, and others. She was the winner of the 2018 Journey Prize and was a 2018 National Magazine Award finalist for fiction. Shashi is also the editor of Events and teaches creative writing at Douglas College. So help me in welcoming Shashi.
Hi, thanks so much for that introduction, Laura, and welcome everyone to Writing with Style. Thank you also to the Wild Writers Festival and the New Quarterly for having me today, and thanks everyone for joining me. So as Laura just mentioned, I'm approaching today's topic from a few different perspectives as a fiction writer, literary magazine editor, creative writing instructor, and of course, as a reader. I read books for two reasons. One, to feel strong feelings, and two, because I love a great sentence. I love writing that has texture and rhythm and momentum. When I was a student in fiction workshops, I found that we tended to focus on discussing bigger picture concerns like plot and character and theme. And I found that it was rare that we spoke about the brushstrokes of writing, like the words and the sentences themselves and how they're used to construct a distinctive narrative voice or to reinforce those bigger picture elements of a story. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. When I was approached to put together this craft session, I thought, now's my chance. Why not talk about sentences? Why not talk about style? However, style is an overwhelmingly large topic. The possible discussion points and techniques feel endless to me. We could talk about writing that's spare versus writing that's ornate. We could discuss rhetorical devices or whether the writing is direct and literal, whether it uses figurative language, whether it has a sense of humor, and so on and so on. So I thought rather than attempting an impossible or a simplistic overview of style, what I would do is pick a handful of passages of fiction that I love and talk about the hodgepodge of techniques that are used in them and really just talk about why I love them. And I found that a lot of the techniques I favored while I was putting together this presentation tend to lean towards ways to create musicality and rhythm in writing. So that'll be our focus for today. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. So Writing with Style, you should see that on your screen. I've also dropped a PDF of this in the chat, just in case anyone wants to view it on a different device, or if I have a bunch of text excerpts on the slide, so if you wanted to look at them later, you could always do that. Okay, so we'll look at some excerpts, identify some techniques and how they're working, and then at the end, I've prepared 3 related writing exercises for you to try at home if you are, like me, a fan of writing exercises. I've prepared about 45 minutes of material, and then I'm planning to save 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So if you have questions, I see, I'm seeing that someone's mentioning you don't have access to the chat. I dropped the PDF in there. Can you not see just the PDF? Okay, if not, at the end, I can maybe provide my email address and send it to anyone who's interested. Okay, yeah, so if you have questions as I'm going through this, you can drop them into the Q&A. I will probably just answer questions at the very end. But if there are any that are specifically about the slides that I'm talking about, feel free to ask them and I'll keep trying to take a look at the Q&A. Yeah, and I'm seeing from people that the chat is disabled. So I will let the tech folks answer these questions. Okay, I'm seeing that it's now open, so I'm going to resend. Sorry about that. This might just take me a second here. Okay, I'm not sure this is going to work. I'm getting an internal error. Yeah, I think it'll be easiest if I just email it to anyone who wants it afterwards, because it's not letting me upload a file. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start with a slide, and I will admit that I first came across this on Facebook. It may initially sound kind of corny, but I think the technique that it highlights is kind of a useful and beautiful one. So I'll start by reading it aloud for us. This sentence has 5 words. Here there are 5 more. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. Okay, oh, I should warn you that I'm going to be reading aloud a lot to you, so hopefully that's okay. I just ate a lozenge in preparation. Okay, so what's particularly interesting to me about this is that the content of the passage only concerns itself, but I think it effectively conveys this point of reminding us to write with our ears open. The technique being played with here is sentence fluency, so just the flow of sentences, the length and structure and syntax and use of punctuation, the arrangement of sentences to create musicality, which is a topic that I guess gets a lot of attention in poetry, but I think it's also important in prose. So I brought in a couple of examples of passages that play with sentence fluency to create a varied rhythm and to support the tone of what's happening in the piece. Okay, so this first one is from Katharina Vermette's The Break. Not going to give you any context on this. I'm sure many people have read this book already. Because I don't think it needs the context for what we're going to do. I will mention, I did cut out a little bit of the dialogue, so that's what that is there. Emily keeps shaking her head feebly. Run. The word just comes to Ziggy. Run. She's a bad runner and can't go that fast, but they can't fight. She's a worse fighter than she is a runner. Fiend, Clayton tries, but he still just sits there with his head in his hands, leaning forward, his shoulders getting white with snow. Emily takes a deep breath. Ziggy can feel it, feel her best friend's fear beside her. A quiet falls over everything. Ziggy feels like she's waiting. Phoenix glares and the other girls tower on the stoop. Clayton just sits there, looking small. She looks at her best friend, who doesn't look at her but can see. Run. Ziggy doesn't know if someone had said it, or if she had said it, or if she just thought it, but the word echoes inside her over and over and over. Run, 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 run. Ziggy pushes Emily in front of her down the path to the street, turns her heel on the squeaky snow, and runs behind as fast as she can. Okay, I think this passage is so effective. I find it so beautiful how sentence fluency affects the rhythm, but also the pacing and the tone. I mentioned that I didn't provide any context for this scene, so you might not even know exactly what's happening, but I think you would still feel the weight of it. I imagine that even if you didn't know the meaning of these words, even if you didn't couldn't read English, for example, or didn't understand English, and I read this out loud to you, you would still understand the intensity of it. That one syllable word "run" as its own sentence is so powerful. To me, it feels almost like another voice entering the narrative. And I guess in a way it is, it's the voice of inner monologue. Or it reminds me of when a new instrument enters a piece of orchestral music. So that was the little short sentence here. We also got all these kind of clipped short sentences surrounding it, but they can't fight. And then we get these kind of medium sentences, and they're structured pretty similarly. You often get name, verb, Emily takes, Ziggy feels, Phoenix glares, Clayton sits. All kind of similar length, similar structure. So setting up this pattern of very straightforward sentences. And it's describing this feeling of just waiting in fear. I think the sentence structure reinforces this suspension, that holding your breath quality of the moment. When I'm listening to this, I'm waiting for these characters to start to move, but also for the sentences to start to move, and then they do. First, we get this slightly longer sentence, and then another short sentence, and then we get this very long sentence here with that pattern of repetition, first the over and over and over, and then, of course, the many runs in a row. And it works almost, I think, like a pounding heartbeat, escalating the sound there. There's also this effect of tension and release. We had all these really short clipped sentences up here, and then here we get these two really long sentences in a row, which are just that tension running downhill. I showed this to one of my classes recently, and one of the students commented on this repetition of the word run and said it feels almost like the word run turns into onomatopoeia, it's like the footsteps of the person running. So basically to say that the tension and intensity of this scene are heightened by the choices the writer makes at the sentence level. I imagine you could, even as an exercise, rewrite this into all sentences of the same length, and I don't think it would be nearly as effective. Okay, next example here. Okay, so this is a Dave Eggers story, or just a little excerpt of it. The story is called After I Was Thrown in the River and Before I Drowned, and it's from his collection How We're Hungry, which has a bunch of really short stories in it. Okay. Oh, I'm a fast dog. I'm fast. It's true, and I love being fast. I admit it, I love it. You know fast dogs that just run by, and you say, damn, that's a fast dog. Well, that's me, a fast dog. I'm a fast dog. Who? You should watch me sometime. Just watch how fast I go when I'm going my fastest, when I really got to move for something, when I'm really on my way. Man, do I get going sometimes, weaving like a missile between trees and around bushes, and then pop. I can go over a fence or a baby or a rock or anything because I'm a fast dog and I can jump like a fucking gazelle. Ooh, man, oh man. I love it. I run to feel the cool air cool through my fur. I run to feel the cold water come from my eyes. I run to feel my jaw slacken and my tongue come loose and flap from the side of my mouth, and I go and go and go. My name is Steven. I can eat pizza. I can eat chicken. I can eat yogurt and rye bread with caraway seeds. It really doesn't matter. They say, no, don't eat that stuff, you. That stuff isn't for you. It's for us, for people. And I eat it anyway. I eat it with gusto. I eat the food and I feel good and I live on and run and look at the people and hear their stupid conversations coming from their slits for mouths and terrible eyes. Okay, I find this piece just kind of a delight to read out loud. My favorite thing to do is to bring this excerpt into class and like not tell them anything about it and just get a volunteer to read it aloud and like watch everyone's reactions. The first time I encountered this story, I was pretty skeptical about a story from the point of view of a dog, because I thought it would have that risk of cutesiness or like a Disney style anthropomorphism, like this shallow but cute personification. But I think this story manages to avoid cliche in taking a dark and strange turn later in the piece. And I think you can see some foreshadowing of that darkness towards the end here as well. The last couple sentences especially, and the spoiler is in the title. I guess I'm veering into talking about character voice here because voice and style are so intertwined. I like to think of it as like style colors voice. I think the humor and the frenetic energy of this voice is in large part created by word choice and sentence structure and often like the abandoning of standard punctuation use. For example, we get things like run-on sentences. I love it. I love it. Places where you would expect a comma or period or semicolon or something. There's just nothing. Lots of exclamation points all over the place. Here, 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 here. Just to kind of evoke that like wild energy and to mimic the speed of the dog's actual movements. The dog is pretty much running throughout this entire story, and it's like a 12-page story. Let's see. Okay, it jumps around a lot. Like here, one of my favorite parts is where it just goes, I go and go and go, my name is Stephen, or here when it's jumping around to different foods. It reminds me of the dog in the movie Up. I don't know if that's maybe that's too old of a reference, but the dog that's very easily distracted. I feel like that's captured here. Lots of repetition, of course. I love it. I love it. Man, oh man. Repeated sentence structure. The sentence structure is also often very basic, like I plus a verb, like I love, I run, I go, I can. And the diction, of course, too, is very like simple and childlike. I think despite the simplicity of the language, the imagery is still quite rich. Like you even get a little simile here, like weaving like a missile. I do have to suspend my disbelief to believe that this dog knows what a missile is, but it is providing imagery and richness. It's not like boring because it's using simple diction. So as I mentioned, there's a real focus on action throughout the story. The dog is just moving the whole time. There's a place near or like later in the story where the dog is jumping from one riverbank to the other side of the river. And there the writer mimics the dog's movements with sentence structure. So you have these long run-on sentences as the dog is running, and then he leaps over the river, and it's just like short sentence, short sentence, short sentence, and then he lands, and then long sentence again as he starts to run. So I think it's really fun to read, and you can really hear the intention behind those sentences. And I think also, like, because I was thinking about the risk of like cutesiness or cliche, there are other ways that Eggers could have done a dog's voice. Like he didn't have to make it adorable and energetic. It could have gone completely against the way that we traditionally imagine a dog's inner monologue. Maybe he could have written like a serious and formal and well-educated dog who's referencing Proust all the time. But I think there's a real sweetness to this character right from the opening paragraph, and that simplicity and innocence endear him to the reader. And then later, when the story does take a dark turn, the dog's experiences of cruelty feel so much more like unfair and terrible in contrast, and it's language choices that are creating that contrast. Okay, my next example here is very different in tone. This is from Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which is a short story and also a chapter in Tim O'Brien's fictionalized memoir, The Things They Carried, which is about his time in the Vietnam War. And this passage, the context of it is it's describing soldiers carrying things during the Vietnam War. It's also playing with sentence fluency, but it's doing a couple of other things that I'll mention too. Mitchell Sanders carried a set of starched tiger fatigues for special occasions. Henry Dobbins carried black flag insecticide. Dave Jensen carried empty sandbags that could be filled at night for added protection. Lee Strunk carried tanning lotion. Some things they carried in common. Taking turns, they carried the big PRC 77 Scrambler radio, which weighed 30 pounds with its battery. They shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer bear. Often they carried each other, the wounded or weak. They carried infections. They carried chess sets, basketballs, Vietnamese English dictionaries, insignia of rank, bronze stars and purple hearts, plastic cards imprinted with the code of conduct. They carried diseases, among them malaria and dysentery. They carried lice and ringworm and leeches and paddy algae and various rots and molds. They carried the land itself, Vietnam, the place, the soil, a powdery orange-red dust that covered their boots and fatigues and faces. They carried the sky, the whole atmosphere. They carried it, the humidity, the monsoons, the stink of fungus and decay, all of it. They carried gravity. Okay, so one of the big techniques that's being used here, I made a definition slide just because I didn't know who would be in the audience, so apologies if you already know this definition. But so anaphora just refers to the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses. So like back here, they carried in a bunch of sentences in a row. So that's anaphora. A friend of mine has a poetry podcast, and I was recently listening to it, and I heard him say that anaphora is like a cheap and easy way to build emotional momentum. Like he seemed to think it was emotionally manipulative. You might agree. I personally love anaphora. It's a technique that I tend to overuse in my drafts and then need to pull back on when I'm revising. I counted the number of times O'Brien repeated the word carried here and just underlined it so you could see them quickly. It's 14 times, and 14 times within just this one paragraph. And you would think that would get repetitive in a negative way, but he does a couple of things. And I think there's like small subtle things to avoid that monotony and to add variation. For example, he doesn't start every sentence with they. Sometimes you get full names in here. Sometimes you get a kind of synonym for carried, like they shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer bear, rather than they carried the weight of memory, or they carried what others could no longer bear. Let's see, he varies sentence length. So the word carried isn't always repeating at exactly the same interval. Like I think if all the sentences were structured the same, started with they, and used the word carried, then that would just be overkill. There are a bunch of different effects of the anaphora or repetition. It creates a rhythm that reflects the pace of these walking soldiers. I think there must be a certain monotony to this endless walking. There are also little bits of like other kinds of patterns within this, like a touch of alliteration, the wounded or weak, for example. When I'm reading it aloud, I really feel the rhythm of some of these longer lists of objects like chess sets, basketballs, Vietnamese English dictionaries. So there's like little bits of repetition within this larger frame of repetition. The anaphora also works to gather and organize a whole flood of imagery, like things that are seemingly unrelated to each other. And it creates this litany or catalog or list. One of the exercises that I'm going to describe or mention at the end is to write a paragraph that's essentially a long list using anaphora to organize it. I think his words here feel grand and epic, partly because of the repetition and partly because of how carefully paced the sentences are. The shortest sentences are often the ones that are making the most impactful statements so that they're given space, like they're not crowded with words. For example, they carried the sky, or they carried infections. Whereas when the individual objects that are being mentioned are not as individually important, they're grouped together in a list like that. Another way he uses anaphora here is by mixing the metaphorical and the literal, or the concrete and the abstract. Like they're literally carrying black flag insecticide, but they're metaphorically carrying the sky and carrying gravity. If you were to try this out on your own, you could use a verb other than carried, like say you wrote a paragraph about a list of items people brought to a party or a potluck or on a trip. For example, she brought chicken wings and juicy gossip, or he brought a charcuterie plate and a negative attitude. Other verbs that could work are like a list of things someone ate or found or saw. She swallowed a gulp of Gatorade along with her pride. And I didn't make a slide for this, but these are also examples of a technique called zeugma. I might be pronouncing it wrong. That's how my professor in undergrad used to pronounce it. It might be zeugma. And that's just a figure of speech in which there's one word that replies to two others in two different senses, like I took my hat and my leave. Okay. I have another example of anaphora, but it's used really differently here. This is from Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. The context is civilization as we know it is over. There's a character named Clark, and he has started collecting all of these objects that are like relics of civilization, and he's assembling an exhibit that he calls the Museum of Civilization. So in this excerpt, he examines and considers one of the objects, which is a snow globe. Clark had always been fond of beautiful objects, and in his present state of mind, all objects were beautiful. He stood by the case and found himself moved by every object he saw there, by the human enterprise each object had required. Consider the snow globe. Consider the mind that invented those miniature storms, the factory worker who turned sheets of plastic into white flakes of snow. The hand that drew the plan for the miniature Severn city with its church steeple and city hall. The assembly line worker who watched the globe glide past on a conveyor belt somewhere in China. Consider the white gloves on the hands of the woman who inserted the snow globes into boxes, to be packed into larger boxes, crates, shipping containers. Consider the card games played below decks in the evenings on the ship carrying the containers across the ocean. A hand stubbing out a cigarette in an overflowing ashtray, a haze of blue smoke in dim light, the cadences of a half-dozen languages united by common profanities, the sailors' dreams of land and women, these men for whom the ocean was a gray line horizon to be traversed in ships the size of overturned skyscrapers. Consider the signature on the shipping manifest when the ship reached port, a signature unlike any other on Earth. The coffee cup in the hand of the driver delivering boxes to the distribution center, the secret hopes of the UPS man carrying boxes of snow globes from there to the Severn City airport. Clark shook the globe and held it up to the light. When he looked through it, the planes were warped and caught in whirling snow. Okay, so tons of texture in this passage. This might seem like a weird comparison, but there's something about the style here that reminds me of the nursery rhyme, "This is the house that Jack built." This is the house that Jack built. This is the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. Hope you don't find that comparison trivializing. The bit from Station 11 uses those same techniques of repetition and then sentences that grow increasingly longer to elaborate on a backstory that leads to the creation of a key item, a house or a snow globe. There was some insightful commentary on the Wikipedia article for This is the House that Jack built, and it said, "It is a cumulative tale that does not tell the story of Jack's house or even of Jack who built the house, but instead shows how the house is indirectly linked to other things and people," which I think is also in a way what Mandel's passage is doing, but her writing achieves something much more sophisticated. Like in her excerpt, the writing is keeping this measured pace in a similar way, I think, to the O'Brien example. And the long sentences force the reader to slow down and look at these details, like one detail at a time. We're invited to look at the snow globe in the same way that the characters in this world would, knowing that no new snow globe will ever be made again, knowing that there are no longer like operating factories or distribution centers. So we're now viewing these items and processes through the lens of wonder and nostalgia, even though we all live in a world where these things still exist. And we've all seen snow globes, but we likely haven't seen them pondered in this way. So her methodical way of describing them and where they came from has the effect of taking something familiar and turning it unfamiliar. Just to narrow in on a couple of other stylistic things she's doing here. In this opening sentence, there's kind of a fun, gentle inversion of words. So we get fond of beautiful objects, and in his present state of mind, all objects were beautiful. Beautiful objects, objects beautiful. I think it's a technique that's perhaps related to anti-metaboly, which is where phrases are repeated and then transposed, like, I know what I like, and I like what I know. There's little bits of alliteration in here, like globe, glide, consider the card games. It's pretty subtle. Even in the end, maybe warped and whirling. It doesn't turn into a tongue twister at any point, but there is like a little bit of repetition, again, within the larger frame of repetition. I think it has this way of like cinematically scanning across time. And then it narrows in on that one image in the end. And that's when the pattern of repetition ends and we see the character's action, like Clark shook the globe and held it up to the light. So it just kind of brings me into that moment. I think the language in this passage and in the O'Brien example too are notably concrete. Like this one is just full of objects and things that we could grasp onto or like physically experience. There are a couple of images here, a hand stubbing out a cigarette in an overflowing ashtray, a haze of blue smoke in dim light, the cadences of a half dozen languages united by common profanity. So there's color and texture and light and sound. She doesn't use a lot of abstract nouns. There are a few, like, I know the word enterprise. Enterprise is over here, state of mind. Hope, I think at some point down the bottom I saw the word hope. So those are more abstract, but generally it's very grounded and specific. It's not like broad generalizations or concepts hovering in space in a way that we can't visualize or grip onto, but it still evokes a sense of universality and this appreciation for a concept that's as abstract as human enterprise. I often say to my students that one of the things that amazes me about writing is that it's just words on a page. Like we just start with this blank piece of like white two-dimensional paper. It doesn't move. It doesn't have color or sound or smell or taste. And then the writer takes that and creates a world on it that's as rich and three-dimensional and multi-sensory as our reality. And I think really the only way to do that is by using concrete words. Okay. The next example is not this one. This is an excerpt from Shruti Swami's The Laughter Artist. That's the name of the short story, and it's from a collection that came out a couple of years ago, House is a Body. This is quite a dark story. It's about a woman who has lived through trauma and she's now coming apart. She's also a laughter artist, and she is taking a class on laughter. There's kind of this contrast between laughter and what, obviously typically has lighter connotations, and the darkness of what she has experienced and what she is currently witnessing. And I'll mention there's nothing like graphic or anything like that in this. This is just the opening couple of paragraphs. Okay. And I should I rush down there with a broom and scare him off her, scare him away from her? Yes, of course, that would be the good human thing. The thing to do when you live here, though, is to stand at the window and watch with the phone in your hand. Across the way, you can see the neighbors in the window doing the same thing. We all stand in our windows like a hall of gods watching, and I am the only one that appears mirthful. I am the only one to laugh. A laugh signifies not just mirth. I am a laughter artist. Artist is certainly a little overblown, though it is actually also my official title. Artist, if I deserve it at all, is because I don't just have a single good laugh, but many of them. I have a harsh laugh, a hissing laugh, a soft laugh, a mocking laugh, a laugh that is pure joy, a sweet bell rung, an angry laugh, an instigating laugh, an infecting laugh, a polite laugh, a comforting laugh. I am developing a laugh that incorporates tones of barking with a dog's whine. It is a begging laugh, a laugh that says please. Can one say please with a laugh? Yes, listen. I'm not going to try to read that laugh aloud. Perhaps you might be better at it than I am. So the voice here is frantic and offbeat and self-questioning. There are a bunch of little choices that are like creating that voice. Nervous, choppy repetition, like should I? Scare him off, scare him away. The good human thing, the thing. Then there's a bunch of repetition of that phrase with the window. Stand at the window, neighbors in the window. I think there's one more somewhere. We all stand in our windows. And then again, I am the only one, I am the only one. So it's pretty like choppy and jumps around it. It's not like a perfect style of repetition. Lots of little like M dashes showing self-interruption and like asking herself these rhetorical questions. Also, the diction is relatively formal. So the word choices are things like mirthful, overblown, signifies, official, instigating, infecting, incorporates. In that last question here, she says, can one say please with a laugh? She could have said the more colloquial, like, can you say please with a laugh? But the voice retains this formality. Okay, so the opening sentences here remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, the opening of it in particular. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. So yeah, same kind of thing, like nervous, choppy repetition, M dashes, self-interruption, rhetorical questions. So a voice that's a little bit off balance and unreliable. Back to this example, the second paragraph starts out kind of staccato with these short sentences. A laugh signifies not just mirth. And then there's that long list of the types of different laughs. It has a breathlessness to it that I think foreshadows the desperation that we see from this character later in the story. There's also lots of contrast in tone just within that list. Like we get harsh and hissing laughs, also soft and pure joy, sweet bell laughs. So there's tension within those word choices, all like juxtaposed close together, even as it's all describing laughter. That particular type of sentence, the one with all the laughs in it, is called a cumulative sentence. So a sentence that starts with an independent clause and is followed by a series of subordinate clauses or phrases. I'll come back to this cannery row sentence in a second. But so I have a harsh laugh. Independent clause, it could be a sentence on its own, like the sentence could just end there, but instead it keeps adding and adding and adding all of these little dependent clauses, accumulating detail. And because it's accumulating, that's why it's called a cumulative sentence. They don't all have to be this long, but I think the long ones have a nice kind of like drama and tension and momentum to them. We did see some cumulative sentences earlier, like if you were to go back and look at the O'Brien excerpt and the Emily St. John Mandel excerpt, both of them use really long cumulative sentences too. And I think making them long and turning them into lists like this creates that rhythmic effect. And then the rhythm can change based on how long the clauses are too. Like this feels much like faster in pace than the Emily St. John Mandel example did. And just to go back to that cannery row sentence. So another cumulative sentence, this is the opening sentence of Cannery Row. Cannery Row in Monterey in California is a poem, a stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, a tone, a habit, a nostalgia, a dream. So same kind of thing, independent clause could just end the sentence there and it would be a full grammatical sentence, but instead the writer keeps adding and adding and adding into a list. One last thing I wanted to mention about this sentence here is it's another kind of repetition, kind of the opposite of anaphora. It's epiphora. I think I have that on another slide. So the repetition of a word or phrase at the ends of successive sentences or phrases rather than at the beginning, the way anaphora is. And a fun fact, epiphora also means the overflow of tears from the eyes, which I think is quite poetic, but it is also a medical condition. Okay, so I have 3 exercises. I kind of just based them on those techniques that I just mentioned. So the first one is to write a 1-paragraph description that involves movement. For example, you could describe a busy city, an orchestral performance, an animal running, a factory, a spin class, or anything you want that involves movement. As you write, consider sentence fluency, varying structure and length of sentences to add music to your prose. And if you wanted to, you could try incorporating other techniques. I think the only one we talked about here was alliteration, but if anyone wants me to define these or give examples of these, we can do that in the Q&A portion. And I have 2 more exercises that I'll tell you about, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. And they don't even have to be specifically related to these slides or anything I've mentioned. If you just have general things you want to talk about with style, feel free to put them in there. Okay, the next one, exercise 2, write a long cumulative sentence in the form of a list. So some options that you could use here, use anaphora or epiphora for rhythm and organization. You could try including a mix of literal and figurative items. For example, he brought a charcuterie plate and a negative attitude. She brought wine and sadness. Play with contrast within the list and consider the intended effect. So do you want a kind of unsettling voice like the one Shruti Swami creates in The Laughter Artist? Do you want to illustrate complexity of a place the way John Steinbeck does in Cannery Row? Okay. And then the third one, I think this is kind of a fun one. It's just to make your own Mad Lib using a favorite sentence. So I just took a couple of sentences I love and turned them into Mad Libs here. The first one is that Cannery Row sentence, and you would just choose a place, like Burnaby, BC, and then replace like an object noun with your own. And then I called these sensory nouns. So a stink, a noise, and some abstract nouns. And I made an example of one using a sentence that we didn't look at. This is from Stuart Diebeck's story, We Didn't. It uses a ton of anaphora as a framing device at the beginning and end of the story, repeating the phrase, we didn't. We didn't in the light, we didn't in darkness. We didn't in the fresh cut summer grass or in the mounds of autumn leaves or on the snow where moonlight threw down our shadows. So same kind of thing. I made a Mad Lib instead of we didn't, just pronoun, verb, same pronoun, same verb, and then kind of filling in the blanks. And then I tried out this exercise and I came up with the sentences. I cried in the morning, I cried in the afternoon, I cried in the dim, empty classroom and by the rows of lockers after the students had left and in the parking lot where snow had buried my car. And I think the fun thing with this is like when you're filling out that Mad Lib, or at least my experience was that I started like seeing different directions the sentence could go in. So I think this part of the fun part is like using this as a template, but then making it your own. Okay, so I'll go to any questions anyone has. I see a couple of here in the Q&A, and then there might also be, and I see that Laura has also dropped the slides PDF in the chat here, so hopefully people can see it now. Okay. So I'm just looking at the questions. One I have here is, when deciding what stories to accept as a literary magazine editor, how important is style versus content? For example, is it more important for a story to be beautifully written or to be important and culturally relevant? And important was in quotes. That's a really good question. I imagine it would vary among literary magazine editors. For me personally, style is huge. Like if a story is written with important subject matter, but the style isn't really doing anything, or the style doesn't like heighten the content, then I think it would be lacking something. I also think that like a beautifully written story, you can get away with a lot in a beautifully written story in a way that you can't if the writing is more kind of like plodding or ordinary. That might just be my own personal taste though. I see a question that says, I wonder what you think of the voice and syntax in Leon Rook's Shakespeare's Dog. I have not read that, so I don't know, but now I'm curious, so I will have to add that to my reading list. Someone is asking for a recommendation on a book of these elements of style. I don't know one on these in particular. Like these are just ones that I kind of noticed when I'm reading. I guess like if you're looking just for a general book on style, there's like the Strunk and White elements of style is kind of a go-to. What is the one? I'm trying to remember the one by the like former copy chief at Penguin Random House. His book was really good and talks in a lot of detail about style, but the name is slipping me. There's also a book that I like that talks about things beyond style. It's Janet Burroway's, I think it's called On Writing Fiction. And she has different chapters on things like, plot and character. But I know she has one chapter where she talks about significant detail or details that matter. And I think I really like that chapter just for how it talks about use of detail, which was one of the things I wanted to talk about today with them. There just wasn't enough time. Okay, I see another question here. You mentioned that you tend to use anaphora a lot in your own writing and then pull back as you revise. How do you know when you've overused a technique? Yeah, that's a good question. For me, I think like when I'm writing, I try not to think too much about technique at all. Like I just write what comes to me, but then when I'm revising, I read it aloud. And especially with a technique like anaphora, I think it's easy to use it, and easy to overuse it, and if you overuse it, it starts to sound melodramatic. So for me, if I'm reading it aloud and I start to kind of like cringe to myself and think it sounds like corny or melodramatic, that's when I know that I need to pull back. Also, like, I'm really a fan of long sentences, but I know that not everyone is. Like, you might be more of a, like, I don't know, short sentence Hemingway type of person. So often, like, once I start working with my editor, I know she has like marked sentences that I've written that are very long, and will say like, oh, maybe you could like pull back on this to like make it easier for a reader to parse. So maybe sometimes getting another person's opinion is useful too. Oh yeah, someone has found the title of that book, which is awesome. Thank you, Sharon. It's Dreyer's English, an utterly correct guide to clarity and style. Maybe I can paste that in the chat too. I'm hoping people can see stuff that's in the chat now. Okay, and another question. In your opinion, would you try to, for writing with style, utilize as many big vocabulary words as possible, or would it still be balanced to use less dramatic words and phrases? Yeah, I definitely wouldn't try to use the like big vocabulary words just for the sake of using them. I think the like diction should be appropriate to the content. Like the Katharina Vermette example we looked at, for example, didn't have like big vocabulary words in it, but it had huge intensity. And I think using a bunch of like Latin thesaurus words in there would probably slow that piece down. I use thesauruses a lot when I'm writing, but I guess I use them more to find the right word and to consider the different senses of words that I'm using rather than to find like a fancy word. Okay, another question. When you write your own work, do you tend to work the stylistic elements on later drafts or right away? In other words, do you just try to get the story out first and then sculpt the text later, or are you thinking about these stylistic elements right off the top? Yeah, that's a great question. I think I am thinking about the stylistic elements because for me, if I was to write just the plot, for example, or just focus on character, I feel like it wouldn't come out sounding like me, like it wouldn't be in my voice. And I think all of those things are woven together. I also think like maybe this presentation makes it seem like while I'm writing, I think like I'm going to use alliteration or I'm going to use anaphora, but I don't think it's that conscious. I think it's more like you write what comes to you or what feels good. For me, writing feels almost like performing music. So I guess I just kind of like hear it and write it that way. But then in the editing is when I go back and try to like shape it into something like more precise and less sloppy. And I think that's the last question is kind of similar. So I think I've answered that. So do you find style emerges in the original drafting, or is it something you add in later revisions? Yeah, for me, I think it emerges in the original drafting phase, but definitely like in revisions, there's like, I might find more ways to incorporate style to like emphasize content. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left if anyone has any other questions. Okay, as someone is saying, these are great examples and so varied, thank you. Do you find yourself adopting these particular styles in your own writing, or are you locked into your own style? Yeah, I think I do, like probably maybe unconsciously adopt like the kind of styles that I like reading. Like I really like, as I had mentioned, I like long sentences and I like really lyrical, descriptive writing. I think like what I tell my students is that the way to develop your style is by reading widely. And actually, when I was doing that Mad Libs exercise for this presentation, I thought like, oh, this could be really useful to me to try this exercise with like types of writing that are very different from my style and see like if I'm capable even of writing in a different way and what elements of someone else's style can I adopt into mine. Okay. Do you have any advice for seeing if style is consistent throughout a longer piece? That's an interesting question. Let's see. For seeing if style is consistent throughout a longer piece. I guess maybe reading it aloud. Like I read everything I write out loud. And then if you're like, you can even record it and play it back and then hear if like the beginning and end of it sounds similar. But I guess style should be consistent, but also like you want to use style to heighten certain moments of a piece. Like I would probably use anaphora in a moment where I'm trying to like crescendo towards the climax of a story. So it's not like every paragraph has to be written the same way. I'm not sure if I answered your question there. Okay. It looks like we are just about out of time. Probably time for one more question if anyone has one. But thank you so much for joining me today, guys, and thanks for all of your very interesting questions too.
There's a question there about young youth writers. If you want to answer that real quick before we wrap up.
Any advice for youth writers? Sure. Let's see. I guess my advice is always just to write, like, especially if you're just starting out. I would think not so much about publishing or about even other people reading it and just focus on getting as much written as you can, because that's how you develop, and to read as much as you can. Yeah, pretty simple. Thank you for the question.
Good to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Shashi. This was really wonderful. I really enjoyed your readings, I think.
Thank you.
We're very engaging. Your students are very lucky to have me teaching them creative writing.
Oh, that's so nice. Thanks.
In closing, I want to remind our viewers that Shashi's books are available for purchase online from Wordsworth's Books. Visit our online book table for a handy overview of all our festival authors' books. Don't forget the next Wild Writers Literary Festival events are on Saturday. We have the second Youth Writers Workshop at 1 p.m. and Tomas Taboji on building the perfect decrepit utopia at 3 p.m. Thank you all for attending tonight's session. And again, thank you, Shashi.
Thank you. Bye.